We're really happy to welcome you here today. And a little bit about Janet Ricard. She's an LCSW licensed clinical social worker who was a school social worker for 35 years and has also maintained a private practice for 40 years. She specializes in treating anxiety disorders such as OCD, panic, and generalized anxiety with children and adults. And she's going to share a couple things on the screen. So Janet, I just asked that I'll be sharing them. Give me a minute or so warning so I can have it ready to get up, whatever thing you want me to share.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction. Some speakers start with a joke. I'm going to start with magic trick. So I'm hoping you can all see this. There's a tiny little rope, and then there's a medium-sized rope, and then there's a long rope. 3 different sizes. So, Goldilocks took a walk in the woods and saw the home of the 3 bears. She goes in and totally is disrespectful. She eats the porridge, she breaks the chairs, and after all that, she was tired. So she goes into the bedroom and she sees baby bear's little bitty bed, and mama bear's medium-sized bed, and papa bear's great big bed. She's kind of selfish, so she decides she wants all the beds to be medium size, just right for her. So anybody have a magic word?
Abracadabra.
There you go. So now they're all the same size, all medium size ropes. The problem is bears are going to come home and baby bear's going to start crying because that bed is too big for him, and papa bear is really going to be upset because that bed is too small for him. So I need you to say the magic word backwards. It's really easy. Just say the magic word backwards.
Magic word backwards.
Magic word backwards. And here we go. Now we got the little bitty one, medium sized one, and the great big one, just in time for the bears to come home and avoid a problem. So I often do magic tricks for children, almost always, sometimes for adults as well. For one, because they're entertaining. Most people enjoy them, but there's a point to them. I'm going to be talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just a modality that is probably one of the most commonly used right now. In the 50s, there was psychoanalytic theory like Freud. And then in the 70s, behavior modification was really big. By the 70s or 80s, cognitive behavioral therapy came into favor, and that is mostly what I use. So the cognitive part stands for your cognitions or your thoughts. And the behavioral part stands for, what you do, your actions. So makes sense that if you do the same old, you'll get the same old result, right? So that's why both your cognitions or your thoughts, and I'm going to use words like perceptions or interpretations, means the same thing, how you perceive, how you interpret your world. We work on altering those or offering new perceptions, as well as looking at ways you might change your behavior, both of which can lead to a healthier and more emotional self. I use it a lot with depression and anxiety. As you heard, I work mostly with anxiety, like obsessive compulsive disorder or panic. And so what I wanted to do today was to present some easy strategies that everybody can relate to, that you can use to maybe work toward a healthier emotional self. Whenever you're ready, if you could put up the optical illusions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to talk about a simple concept of fact and feeling. Both are important, but they have different uses. So.
Oh, it fell down. It broke off. Oh no.
Let's go to
showing a slide. Sorry.
Let's go to figure 1. If you can see that.
You get it. Seriously, you need to think about this. Think about yourself in the car.
So in figure 1, if I say, what is that? Some people immediately say, well, it's a goblet or a sand timer or bird bath. And other people say, what? It's 2 people looking at each other. So indeed, they're both there. If you look at the white part, it looks like a king's goblet or maybe a bird bath. But if you look at the black part, it's two faces facing each other.
Yep.
So they're both there. It just depends on your perception. I might add a speech bubble to one of those people and say, what is one thinking or saying? There's no right or wrong answer. But for example, when I worked at the high school, I often had students referred to me who had just been in a conflict of some sort. And they would often fill in that bubble with something like, back off, get out of my face, leave me alone, something hostile. I also had students referred to me that were maybe sad because a relationship had ended. And they would fill in the bubble with something like, is he gonna kiss me? So those are really opposite ends of the spectrum, one hostile, one romantic. And some kids would just look at me and say, hi, how are you? Which is an innocuous response. The point being that hopefully you saw one first and then were immediately able to see the other one. It is a matter of perception. If we want to take a quick look at figure 2, usually I ask somebody what they can see. Do we still have that? So in figure 2, there's a picture of a woman and I'll say, describe what the woman looks like. So I'll either get, well, can't really see her because she's faced away from you. She's looking away, but she's probably attractive. She's probably young. You can just kind of see her hair tucked behind her ear. She's got one of those choker necklaces on, but she's looking away. And then other people say, what are you talking about? It looks like an ugly Halloween witch. She's got a big crooked nose and a pointy chin that's stuck down in her mink stole or whatever it is. She's threatening. Sometimes you can't see both immediately, but if you don't try too hard, one will just pop out. So there are indeed 2 women there. A Halloween kind of witch with a big crooked nose and pointy chin that looks threatening, because if your ball rolls in her yard, you're not getting it back. And then the young woman who's faced the other way. So the big one I want to go to is figure 5. Pretty simple one. There are 4 crosses on the page. And if I ask you which one is the tallest cross, everyone would say the one on the right. However, I can change your mind about that in less than 30 seconds. If I ask you, instead of perceiving those as 4 crosses on a page, perceive them as telephone poles and add the dimension of depth. So now, you're driving down the road, you're passing these telephone poles. Now, if I ask you which is the tallest telephone pole, you'd likely say, well, they're all the same size. Because if you, in your human brain, this is only 2 dimensions, but if I ask you to view them in 3 dimensions, then it's easy to see that each one is further away. But from experience that they're all the same size. It just looks smaller as it gets further away. Like if you're in a plane and you look down and you see a car that looks like an ant, that's not the size of an ant. So I was successful in making a suggestion to you where you changed your perception or your interpretation about what you were seeing, and you experienced it differently. You could easily experience those as all the same size. Okay, so that is an example. You could take that down. That is an example of just a simple suggestion that I might make to somebody to help them change their perspective if they have a really negative or troublesome perspective of something, of a situation, of a person, of a relationship. Sometimes just making some suggestions for how to view that differently can make all the difference in the world and can turn a negative or distressing perception into one that is innocuous or even positive. So back to fact versus feeling. If I say, what is the color of the leaves in back of me? They're green. So is it a fact or a feeling that the leaves are green or some shade of green? Most would agree that's a fact. But if I say green is the most beautiful color in the world, that's a perception. That's my interpretation, my opinion. And so another little strategy is to help people recognize as you're going through life and you're viewing your world, what you see, what you hear, your experiences, those are factual in your mind. That's the way it is. That's your reality. But is it? So often we don't recognize that we have predisposing ideas for perceiving things. And so what you feel is a fact is not a fact at all. It's simply your opinion, your interpretation, your perception. So the idea that green being the most beautiful color in the world is just a way to demonstrate. I might look at green and think it is the most lovely color in the world, but it would be an error to interpret that as a fact and that everyone thinks so. And this is how we often get into problems in relationships and so on. So let me give you another example. It's as simple as A, B, C, D. So A stands for, well, formally it stands for the activating event, but let's just call it the action. It's whatever happens. The B stands for your belief about it. Again, it could be your perception, your interpretation. I just use B because A, B, C, D is so easy to remember. So something happens. You see it, you hear it, you experience it, and you immediately have a perception or an interpretation about what just happened. The C stands for consequence. This is how you feel about what just happened, or maybe what you decide to do. The D, this is the important part. This is the therapeutic part of the equation. We can dispute that belief and substitute another one, perceive something else, if that belief is something that is distressing to you. So here's an example. There are people coming to my office and they're sitting just across the room. They're sitting 5 feet from me, 6 feet from me, and they're sharing very personal pieces of their life, sometimes some very intimate and hurtful pieces of their life, and trusting me with those. So let's just say the next day, we're both in the grocery store. The A is, we appear to make eye contact. This person, we'll call her Susan. Susan looks at me. I appear to look at her for a second, but then I look away. She smiles and waves, and I just keep going. I don't acknowledge her with a word or with anything else. I walk away. So let's say, if you can imagine being in that situation, what would be your immediate perception about what just happened? So I asked this question. Some people will say, well, I'd assume you don't like me, because a lot of people don't like me. If somebody comes in very depressed, that might be indeed what they say, which is really sad. And so the consequence is that I would just reinforce that belief that they're not a very nice person and nobody likes them. And so they would feel even more sad and depressed. Or a person might say, especially it's interesting if I have somebody that comes in with anger control issues, they might say, well, I'd say that you were just being an arrogant snot. You think you're too good for me. I'm okay in your office where I'm paying you, but out in public, you're too good for me. So the consequence would, they would feel very irritated and annoyed, and they certainly would not come back to see me again. And then I have people that would say, well, I think you were lost in your own world. You can drive somewhere and negotiate all the turns and the lights and so on, but your mind's a million miles away on your last vacation or your next vacation. And so you're just kind of on autopilot. That could certainly happen, that somebody could wave at me and I might look like I'm looking at them, but I'm not really thinking about it, and my mind's somewhere else. Or it might be that I don't have my contacts in right now, or my glasses. And so if I were to look at something 10 feet away, it would be a total blur. I would not recognize the person. That's how bad it is without my glasses on. So a person might laugh at that and think that, wow, she's so vain, she won't even put glasses on her face. Or I don't like the feel of glasses between me and the person I'm talking to in my office. So right there, we have 4 completely different explanations, with consequences being anger and irritability, sadness, humor, or really just innocuous. She's in her own world. There is another one. Let's just say the person came, even followed up and said, hey, what's going on? I just smiled and waved at you. You ignore me. What's up? So if I don't like you, if I think I'm too good for you, I'm probably not going to say that. I'm going to say, oh, I didn't see you. So you still won't know. So why, when you realize you actually have a choice, that your belief to that situation is just that, a belief, it's not a fact, If the consequence is negative, you can use that D, the dispute, and say, okay, well, what else could it be? I just offered you 4 different explanations. The 5th one being, if that happens to me in real life, it's probably because if I'm with somebody, I don't want to have to explain. I say hi, and then my husband or whoever I'm with says, well, who was that? Well, I can't say because I just violated your confidentiality. And so it's a lot easier if I do see a client to maybe just try to go the other way before they see me, because I don't want to be in that awkward position of not wanting to acknowledge you and or violate your confidentiality. 5 explanations, all of which are entirely possible. So if you have a distressing consequence, if you feel angry or sad, realize that you can dispute that, and you can just as well assume, I didn't see you, I'm preoccupied, I don't have my glasses on, I don't want to violate your confidentiality, all of which are good, valid answers. You'll never know the answer. So how unhealthy is it to go with the explanation that causes you pain or distress when you can just assume that any of the others is true? So I feel like that ABCD formula is a simple formula that when you do it a number of times, you can do it in an instant. To me, it's just a way of life that I recognize that all of a sudden I feel angry or sad. Freeze frame. What just happened? What did I believe or perceive about it that caused me to feel angry or sad? What's an alternate explanation? And then I'm going to go with that one. It can apply in so many situations. And I think that people we call optimists or Pollyannists, they do that automatically. They assume the best. And people that are chronically annoyed and irritated, they tend to chronically look at the worst part of the situation. The key being you have control over stopping, freeze framing, and saying, okay, here's how I perceive that. But that is a feeling, a belief. That's not a fact. Substitute another one, dispute it with another one, and you walk away feeling a lot better. It's also called stinking thinking. I left a handout, and I don't know if anybody was able to get it, but apparently it's been Xeroxed and it's somewhere. It's similar to the ABCD, but it's a whole series of, for example, black and white thinking is either I got an A or I'm a failure. Or labeling. I tripped over something, so I must be a klutz, even though I'm athletic and I just didn't see that there was something on the floor. It goes through a whole bunch of ways that we use our emotions to think and draw conclusions. So it's similar to ABCD, but it shows how often we use emotions to gain our perspectives. So here's an example, all or nothing. You look at things in absolute or black and white categories. Overgeneralization, something happens and it's like, that's the story of my life. That always happens, when indeed that is not really true. Mental filter is what I kind of just described. You dwell on the negatives, discounting the positives. There are people that are constantly focusing in on what didn't go right, what they didn't do well, who doesn't like them. And they don't even take the time to realize that that doesn't define things. Those are examples, and they might even be minority examples. Jumping to conclusion, you assume that you know people are reacting. Well, assume that you know what somebody's thinking. You don't. Magnification or minimization is my favorite one. I just call it catastrophizing. I recognize that if something happens to me that is not plan A, I have a tendency to say, oh my gosh, that's awful, that's terrible. And I make a catastrophe out of it. When chances are, by next week, I won't even remember that it happened, because it really was trivial in the whole scheme of things. But at that moment in time, it sure seems important. So I just like the word catastrophizing. It's a delicious word. Emotional reasoning. I trip over something, I fall. So now I say, I'm such a terrible klutz. No, I did trip over something and I probably should pick that up and make sure I don't trip over it again. Shoulds, we all know what those are. Labeling, personalization, and blame. I see that a lot where people take over responsibility. And so these are examples of, imagine that the next time you feel an icky feeling. So that could be anger, it could be frustration, it could be any of those unpleasant feelings. I bet if you were to kind of say aloud how you were feeling or what was going through your mind, I bet you'd find it on that list. and you'd realize, I'm catastrophizing, or I'm thinking of this in black and white, or I'm labeling myself, those kinds of things. When you do that, you have a chance to say, okay, or, and again, you have a little bit more rational logic based thought, because all of those things, we all do them, but they're all emotional based thinking that doesn't necessarily reflect anything that, the state accurately. So by doing that, it's kind of a humorous way to say, okay, and think of things in a little bit more logical, rational way. Couple more examples, just to get a feel for the kind of ways that I might ask people to reframe or reperceive things. Most people have had a nightmare, pretty universal experience. So when you have a nightmare, there are neurons firing in your brain that produce sensory information, visual information, auditory information, tactile information. So if you have a nightmare about a bad guy chasing you with a knife, those neurons are actually firing, producing images of the guy. Maybe you can hear him breathing or threatening you. You can feel the cold blade of the knife, all of those things. So you wake up and you're in full fight or flight. Your heart is pounding, your muscles are tense, you're having this, oh my gosh, catastrophe kind of thought. Your breathing is rapid in upper chest. All of the things in fight or flight that if it was a real catastrophe, caveman days, you run across a saber-toothed tiger, you don't have time to say, what is that? Oh yeah, it's a tiger. They're dangerous. Well, I better get out of here. Dead meat. So fight or flight is highly adaptive because it allows us to instantly either fight or flee. There is a freeze, but I'm not talking about that so much, which is very adaptive if there is actually a threat. Problem is, in life, we go into fight or flight reactions when it's not actually a threat, it's a perceived threat. We might think something is not good, but there isn't an act. Obsessive compulsive disorder is full of that. If I leave the lights on and I don't check them, the lights are on, the house is going to burn down, as an example. Or I left the faucet dripping, my house is going to be flooded. Well, no, it's not, but that's the obsessive thought that you become convinced of. So in the nightmare, you wake up and you can say, oh my gosh, it was just a bad dream. But in the meantime, your amygdala, that's the fear center of your brain, it went off and it signaled the brain to produce things like cortisol and adrenaline. Cortisol and adrenaline are real brain chemicals that trigger fight or flight. Again, wonderfully adaptive if there is a danger, awfully maladaptive if there isn't. So in the nightmare, you are safe and sound in your own bed. That's the reality. Yet your amygdala sensed danger, and so it fired and told the brain to produce cortisol and adrenaline. So you're laying safe and sound in bed with your heart pounding and your muscles all tensed up and you're sweating and you're thinking, oh my gosh. And it doesn't go away just because you realize it was a nightmare. It takes a while for those brain chemicals to be reabsorbed and everything to go back to normal. And so recognizing when we have false alarms, all sorts of things happen that aren't plan A. And if you catastrophize, you send yourself into fight or flight. So the first step is, I call it the re's. You relabel, okay, this is just a false alarm. You reattribute. Your heart is pounding wildly, not because there's actually a danger, but because your body's trying to protect you and produce the cortisol. So you reattribute and realize that's what's actually happening because it feels dangerous. But if you reattribute that I'm in fight or flight, there's not really a danger. Another thing is part of that fight or flight cycle, there are a couple of things that you can control. You can control your breathing. You can control your muscle tension when you recognize that. And so standard stuff in treating anxiety for anybody, it's not the whole thing, but simple little things to realize how to do deep diaphragmatic breathing. For example, an inhale to 5, hold 1, 2. The exhale should be a little slower, hold 1, 2. So you take, when you're anxious, to calm down, you might take breaths that inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold 1, 2, exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hold. And you do that a couple of times. The two things to remember to do it correctly, because it's not automatic. I guarantee you, when people come into my office and they're anxious, if I ask them to put one hand on their belly and one hand on their upper chest, I will see their upper chest moving. Unhealthy way of breathing. So what you want to do is make sure that all the air is filling your belly, like you got a balloon in there, and then exhaling. That the hand on your chest is minimally moving. The air needs to go down in your diaphragm or your belly, fill it up. The other thing that's important to remember about good, healthy breathing style is that the exhale should be a little slower than the inhale. So if I did the opposite, if I inhale slowly and exhale quickly, it would be like, that's more like panting. That doesn't calm you down at all. So anybody can do it. It reverses that whole fight or flight cycle. If you take control of your breathing and you take control of your muscle tension, anybody can do it, but it is something you have to learn to do correctly and practice. So inhaling, hold for a second, exhale more slowly, and make sure the air is going from your belly. And then with the muscle tension, with kids, I play the game about kind of Simon Says, and we tighten the fists and tighten the shoulders. And if you hold it long enough, you start to shake, and then you release it, and you can just feel the relief. But you can go from your eyebrows, make a frown, tighten your shoulders and your neck and your arms and make fists, and you can go all the way down to curling your toes, and then release every one of them. Again, an exercise I do with people that I know this isn't natural is I ask permission to take their wrist, and I'll say, okay, tell me when you're relaxed. You just relax and tell me when you're relaxed. Okay, I'm relaxed. You think that's relaxed? But that happens consistently with anxious people, is they're thinking they're relaxed. This is anything but relaxed. If they were truly relaxed, their hand would drop like a dead weight. And so learning to really appreciate the feeling of your muscles being completely relaxed. So imagine that you get anxious for some reason. If you tune into your body, your muscles are tense, your breathing is probably tense, you've got the oh no messages going on. We don't worry about the heart rate or some of those other things, because those are less controllable. But you can, yoga does all of these things. It tunes into the muscle relaxation. It tunes into the deep belly diaphragmatic breathing. It tunes into the relaxing messages. That's why yoga can be so healthy for people with anxiety, because it teaches you all those skills in a fun way. But I mention it just because it's things that everybody can do. So, and the mindfulness part of that, the mindfulness is just the awareness of what's happening inside your body, where you're carrying tension, what's happening inside your brain. Like if you have the oh no messages, I call them what ifs and oh no's. If it's an anxious thought, you could probably preface it with what if, or oh no, fill in the blank. So turning mindfulness is just being aware of all those and gently accepting. It's non-judgmental, not, oh, what an idiot I am for having that thought, or here I am tense again. It's completely accepting, non-judgmental, that this is what I'm feeling inside my body. This is what messages I'm hearing. But I have the power to control those and change those. You got to recognize it first, and then you got to know how to do it in a more healthy pattern. But these are all the kinds of skills that anyone can learn to do to have more of a feeling of control over anxiety and depression. Obviously, it's not as simple as that, and I individualize this highly, but that's the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I know you said about a half an hour. I can end here for questions, or if you want to do that video that I sent you about the selective attention, we can do that. Why don't y'all decide if you want to?
I can see if I can pull up the video for you.
Okay.
That'd be great.
So
Yeah.
to preface the video, and it may have those ads that you can skip ad on there, but the video is about 2 or 2.5 minutes long. It's about selective attention. And so it's going to show you these two teams of kids playing basketball. One has white shirts, one has dark shirts, and the directions are count the number of times the team with the, I guess it's the white shirts, passes the ball. That's okay. So I use that video
And teaching.
because unfortunately, first of all, let me say that well over half of the people I show that to never see the gorilla. So if you didn't see it, you're in good company. Unfortunately, the video kind of froze for a second right when the gorilla was in the middle, which I think might have diverted some people's attention to the gorilla. But if it hadn't frozen just there, about half the people don't see the gorilla. I use that as an example of we're going to see what you expect. If you're focused on the positive, if you're focused on people who are kind and giving and nurturing, you're going to see that everywhere. If you're kind of jaded and resentful, and your belief is that people will be mean and take advantage of you and will be disrespectful, you're going to see that everywhere too. You're going to see what you expect. This is so powerful that one client, for example, had a form of obsessive compulsive disorder that we call body dysmorphic disorder. She thought she was horribly ugly. She was average looking, if not attractive in my mind, honestly. But she had this obsessive belief that she was disgustingly ugly, and it affected her life because she didn't want to go out in public. She didn't want to expose people to her ugliness. And so I asked her to do an exercise. I asked her to go to the mall and walk from one end to the mall to the other and just watch people's reaction. Well, and it was exactly what she expected. People avoided her eye contact. People didn't smile at her because she was walking through the mall, just barely glancing up and frowning. Then I asked her to walk again, but this time deliberately make eye contact with as many people as she can momentarily and just give them a big smile and walk on. You can imagine that her experience was completely different. She had to admit the second time that people smiled at her, people nodded at her, people acknowledged her. And it all came from her. She had been so convinced of her ugliness that it just got reinforced with, see, I can prove it because nobody will look at me, nobody smiles at me. But when I forced her to focus on something different, it was there too. That was a powerful session when that happened, but I offer it because the gorilla video is very entertaining. It's very short, but it does present a very important point that you will get optimists and consistently experience people having positive reactions to them. People that are resentful and negative consistently have the opposite, but it's not because the people are any different. It's because that's what they see. Just like, for goodness sake, you didn't see a gorilla, life-size gorilla, walk across the screen because you were looking at the ball. So you're going to experience what you expect. All right, so those are some examples of what you might experience with cognitive behavioral therapy, and maybe just a little bit of a flavor for how that can change your perception for the positive.
Thank you, Janet. That was really eye-opening.
especially the gorilla. I certainly
Did you see that gorilla?
no, I did not.
No,
I didn't.
No, isn't that amazing?
It
Yeah.
is.
Truly amazing.
I saw it, but then I didn't see 15 passes of the ball.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, most people, they want to get it right. They know there's a right answer. And so they're really focused. You know who sees the gorilla all the time is people with ADHD. They always see the gorilla.
Oops,
Why is that?
that's news.
Why is that?
Because they're so distractible that they can't focus on just the one thing and they're noticing everything. Not necessarily a bad thing. It's just an observation that I've had that holds true so often.
Very interesting.
By the
I'm-
way, for those of you who are interested, those two authors, one of whom I think still teaches, they were both at Harvard, or one of them was at Harvard, and I think Simon is here at the U of I now. But they have a book called The Invisible Gorilla, where they have several chapters of illustrating that same thing, only under different circumstances, including law enforcement folks who are chasing what they think are suspects and completely misperceiving what's going on. So even if you have training, sometimes your mind can be tricked very easily.
Mm.
I think that's a great example. Law enforcement, everybody in law enforcement should see this and recognize how their own biases might totally change their perception.
Very interesting.
I'm curious, Janet, about your work as a school social worker, and I would assume that your interactions with students in school are really short, 5 or 10 minutes at a time, or did you have regular sessions with the same students so that they could get more help, or just how did that work?
Well, at the beginning of my career, I pretty much didn't even see students. It was ridiculous. My role was in special education. I participated in the evaluations, which was mostly interviewing parents and then coming back to the
Cool.
table and representing their perspective. I wouldn't even necessarily meet the child. But as things evolved and I became a one building person instead of district wide, I made it a point to do a lot of proactive kinds of things. So I ran groups with kids. One was called Empathy Group because I recognized there were some entitled children who had no empathy. I met with them weekly for about a half an hour. That was a tough group. I had a group for children with attention deficit disorder to try to help them gain some enhanced focus skills and learn more about their impulsivity and how to control it. I ran a lot of groups. I also had kids with IEPs that were assigned to me that I might see for about a half an hour a week. And so that gave me a lot more time. I went in classrooms and did social skills kinds of things. And then once the kids knew me, they were more likely to self-refer. So when they were having a bad day, they were having a sad day, they had some things going on, I was visible enough that kids could self-refer or teachers could refer to come in just, at any particular time that they felt the need. Nurses would also often say, okay, I got one that I think is more emotional than physical. And so they'd send me in. So I got to do a lot more of that work and work with kids the last 10 years or so.
Right,
Much more fulfilling than endless evaluations.
right. Did I do all the buildings? Yeah, I assume you were in Champaign School District?
No, I'm in Bloomington.
Oh, okay.
So I
Um,
had in Bloomington District 87, the most I had at one time was 6 buildings. Just not doable. And then went down and down and down till I finally was, the last 10 years of my career were the most wonderful because I was one building. Each building had either a counselor or a social worker. We were
Mhm.
responsible for special ed, but we were also had the liberty to, like I created a program for truants to try to get, no one, you shouldn't be truant in elementary. It's bad enough at high school, much less elementary. And I decided to make that my mission. My biggest thing was bullying, where I discovered that I was unlikely to change the bullies, but I could bully proof, so to speak, some of the children that were being bullied to learn how to cope with it in a different way. And I spent a lot of time doing that.
Thank you. So
Janet, I'm sorry.
Cool.
Janet, what are some of your strategies
for dealing with people or children who don't display empathy? And are they successful?
Yeah, I'm not sure how successful it was. I felt the need to do it because this one year we had 5, they were all boys that came from nice backgrounds. So it wasn't the excuse of some of the chaotic, neglectful backgrounds that some of the kids came from. I, in my mind, called them little princes because they all thought they were. We did a field trip once and the teacher said, no, we're not going through the gift shop. Nobody's going to get popcorn. But there was a grandmother that had come on as a chaperone and she took her child in and got him popcorn and allowed him to eat it in front of everybody. He was one of the entitled kids. And I just thought, oh my goodness. So I started off with a statement that probably shocked them. I said, you're the most important person in the world to your mom, your dad, your grandma. But here at Bent School, you're no more important than anybody else. And they were all kind of shocked. And I thought I might get a phone call or two about that. But we just, I tried to do multimedia things. Sometimes we had videos, sometimes we had books and did, started with the stories. I had little worksheets. I had games where they had to cooperate and just all kinds of ways to show them the difference between somebody that puts themselves above everybody else and what the reaction of their peers would be. And maybe the good feeling that they could get from helping somebody, from asking them a question about themselves, all different ways to show caring. I don't know how effective it's hard to tell. That it's not one of those where I had a pre and a post test, other than report from teachers. And some of these kids were smart enough, they knew exactly what the right answers were. And so they talk a good game and then go back on the playground. But I don't know. I just thought it's something I needed to try to at least awaken a little bit of awareness about what it would feel like to be a caring person that took others into consideration, just to try that. I think you never know either how much impact you have. It may not be immediate, but if I plant a seed, I may never know that at some point in the future, they'll remember an exercise, they'll remember some words, they'll remember a feeling, they'll have experienced a different way of thinking that just might hit them when they need it. That's what I would hope for.
Thank you.
I have a comment about the thinking errors. I think it's actually really important for people who are not thinking they have mental health issues or anxiety or any of those things to realize they probably do have the thinking errors. And that if you identify for yourself what your thinking errors are, it can impact how you interact with people in general. It's very useful to know what your patterns are that you use. So that list that you had up earlier, I think is really helpful for anybody, not just those folks who need services, to take a look at and really kind of think about how you respond to the world.
Oh, absolutely. I think that these things that I've presented are useful to everybody. You don't have to have depression or anxiety. They're life skills. It's just healthy emotional self. But I think they're hard to imagine a person that doesn't make some of those errors sometimes. But you identify your favorites. Like I know I do the, oh my gosh, magnification, sometimes the catastrophizing. See, and then you can laugh when it happens instead of saying, what is wrong with me? You just kind of smile and substitute.
I'm
So
very
if
partial
anybody-
to.
Oh, if
ahead.
anybody wants that list, go ahead and email me. I put my email in the chat, and I can send it to you via email. If you want a paper copy, I have all the paper copies. So if you can't print it out, let me know because I'm happy to send you a paper copy too.
I would like a copy.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, my favorite one is feeling responsible for everybody else's failures. That's my favorite. That I find myself doing often is thinking, oh, if I had just done this, that person wouldn't have this issue, which is also very egotistical because I really can't solve everybody's problems. But that's my go-to of that list, the one at the bottom.
So it's maybe creating a little statement for yourself. One of the exercises I would have people do is draw whatever their version of, maybe it's their anxiety monster, their depression monster, whatever. So it could be a big green blob, it could be a devil looking thing, could be anything. And then we put a speech bubble there. What are the main messages you get? And so it could be something like, your failure, you can't do it. It could be, well, it could be anything. But then I have them also draw their smart brain logical message. It may actually look like a brain. It may look like people do libraries or books because they're full of information. People draw computers, and then what messages to counteract that. So the message, that was my fault, could turn into, I have to let people take responsibility for their own stuff. So create a message for both.
Susan, I think you're right. There's a preacher that I admire, Barbara Brown Taylor, who talks about the expression truth or consequences, and we're much more interested in consequences than truth. And so when tragedy happens or a failure happens, we wonder what we did wrong. Yeah.
Janet, one other thing, for several years, I taught library administration, and I used to have these case studies that would present, typical kind of management problems. And I'd warn the students ahead of time that I was going to try to trick them. And then they were able to take these home and then write up their response to it. And so I think you emphasized how difficult this is, and it is because very rarely did the students really get all those things and see my misdirections, even though they knew I was trying to misdirect them. So thank you for that list. I think putting it on the refrigerator will be very helpful, but it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I say the way to use it to me is like a 3-part thing. The first is whenever you have an icky feeling, any uncomfortable feeling, that's when you stop for a second, locate it on the list where you can say, okay, I'm labeling, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. You can usually find it on there. And then the third piece of that is don't stop there, generate another self-statement that is healthier, that is more logical. It's not enough just to recognize it. I think you also need to generate a different message for yourself.
I think it's really easy to spend a lot of time at I can recognize it, but I can't stop it from being my first reaction. Do you think people really can get to the point where they change their first reaction versus just being able to recognize it and switch it?
I absolutely do. I think that it is a skill like any other skill that has to be practiced. You wouldn't think you could decide to play the piano and be playing it like a pro a week later, or a sport a week later. I think that if this is a goal that you have, it's a matter of getting into the habit anytime you have any icky feeling, which could happen multiple times a day, to just stop for a frame for a second, look at this list to recognize it. And like I said, make the effort to generate a new message. You do that often enough, it becomes, I think, very, very quick that you can recognize that feeling, recognize what you're doing. And as you generate these new messages, those become your go-to at a point, especially if you're doing the same thing over and over, where I'm catastrophizing over and over. At a point, I see that pretty quickly, and I can jump right in there and say, this won't even be a blip on the screen in a week from now. And I know that to be true, but that's one I've said to myself so often that it comes to me instantly. So I've been able to curtail my catastrophizing and instead smile and realize, okay, seems like a big deal now. I won't even remember it next week. So yes, I do think you can internalize those that you do frequently.
I might mention that I use your sleeping things to go to bed at night, because that keeps me from thinking about all the things I was doing in the day. And I find I fall asleep very quickly if I breathe in and then breathe out as you recommended.
Good, yeah. It makes scientific sense, because we know that fight or flight is real. We know that process that happens when the amygdala fires, and cortisone and adrenaline are real, even if there's just a little bit of them. That's all part of that cycle of things that you can actually take control of and reverse the cycle. I also in my office have a hand thermometer. It's really just a thermometer with a sensor that you can hold in your hand, because most of the time, the more tense people are, the colder their hands are. That's not always true. Some people sweat profusely when they're anxious, but the idea that with the feedback from the thermometer, you can raise your hand temperature, that's a pretty powerful thought. And it's just one more of the fight or flight things that you consciously take control over. But it is taking control over reversing the whole fight or flight thing. It's not, it's based on science, but it's not technical and difficult.
Any other questions from anybody? Final question for Janet. Well, Janet, thank you so much. I think this was really helpful for all of us. And again, if you want the checklist of cognitive distortions, I will send it to you if you email me. For anybody that's not from our church, my email is LAURENTOLS@AOL.com. And it is in the chat right now too.
And I like to call it stinking thinking. Cognitive errors sounds so stuffy. So there's a guy named Zig Ziglar that was a motivational speaker years ago. I don't know, some of you may have remembered his name. It's quite the unique name, but he just called it stinking thinking. I like that better.
Thank you so much. This is super.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.